The year was 1951, and the railroad in question was the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, sometimes called just ATSF or even just Santa Fe. Actually, most people just say Santa Fe. Now, Santa Fe used to be one of the largest systems in America, and they're not around anymore. Technically, they merged in 1996 with Burlington Northern to become Burlington Northern and Santa Fe. The incident in question took place in Topeka, Kansas. Since Topeka is one of the larger cities in Kansas, it was a pretty major freight hub for Santa Fe, and there is a bridge that goes over the Kansas River, which flows right through Topeka. Also, the river is sometimes just called the Kaw, which is the most Kansas name I've ever heard in my life, but we'll roll with it. Okay, the Kaw River, or Kansas River. I'm just gonna say the Kaw, because it sounds like I'm trying to imitate a crow. I don't know why we do this around here. Okay. Now, in the early 50s, Santa Fe was rapidly moving towards dieselization. They were pretty gung-ho about it themselves, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why one of the most famous liveries for car-body diesels happens to be the Santa Fe coat of paint. They were one of the earliest that saw great success and were seen fairly often. But Santa Fe had moved so rapidly that they had a ton of steam engines just kind of kicking around. Now, most of them were already destined for the scrapyard. But the thing about scrapyards is that they have capacity limits. They can't just throw every single steam locomotive into the yards all at once. It's just not going to happen. So Santa Fe had a ton of old rolling stock that was just kind of chilling, just hanging out. Just being like, hey, you gonna use this for anything? Oh, you're gonna cut us up for parts. Oh, good. I feel so happy about that myself. And I'm sure this is the part where people wonder why they weren't preserved. Well, some were, but also you have to remember that, especially back then, and even today, there would not nearly be enough heritage railways to take on the amount of rolling stock that Santa Fe was trying to get rid of. The steam locomotives in question regarding this story were number 3167, number 4076, who were both 282 Mikado types, as well as number 1035, which was a 262 Prairie type. Now, Mikados are actually a very, very, very famous type of steam locomotive. They were one of the most prevalent here in America and in other regions. The 282 wheel arrangement was violently successful. Even after the Mikados allegedly became obsolete, many railroads still wound up using them because their replacements just weren't as efficient. Like, it's true, many larger locomotives were more powerful, but the Mikados were so good with what they did, they were hard-pressed to get rid of them, at least until diesels came along. As for 1035, well, like I said, it's a Prairie type, 262. These were smaller, but still very, very successful locomotives. My European audience probably is wondering why this wasn't a tank engine, as 262Ts were a lot more common in, say, the UK, for example, but over here, we gave our 262s tenders. Either way, they were small but efficient, powerful for their size, and were good at branch line work and shunting work. All the steam locomotives in question, by the way, had been working for Santa Fe for decades at that point, and they put in a lot of work. They were good locomotives, and it's a shame to say that they were going to be scrapped regardless of what happened on July the 13th, 1951. There was a really awful flood in Topeka, and I mean that. It's quite literally known as the Great Flood of 1951. It flooded the Kansas River, the Kaw, the Missouri River, as well as other areas in the central United States. The flooding killed 17 people and displaced over 500,000 more. In Topeka in particular, the Kaw crested at 40.8 feet, or 12.4 meters. For reference, that's 14.8 feet above flood stage, or 4.5 meters. There was a lot of water all over the place. It was bad. Now you might be thinking, oh, well the flood must have been so bad it actually flooded the rail yard. Well, it did, but that's not why these engines got thrown into the water. See, Santa Fe had a really... Well, I think it's very weird. Let me explain this. There was a railroad bridge over the Kaw, and in order to prevent a washout from the flooding, the Santa Fe Railroad actually stuck a bunch of their old rolling stock, cars, and engines on the bridge. Just sitting there. To help the situation, apparently. Now, I am not a structural engineer, okay? My personal education in that field stopped right about Lincoln Logs. So I'm by no means an expert on the idea involved with this little setup Santa Fe had going on, but it sounds really bizarre to me. Now, I can understand possibly putting the rolling stock on the bridge to prevent, like, the rails from getting washed away, but that's a ton of weight just sitting on that bridge. Wouldn't that stress it more? If there was a flood situation? If there are any structural engineers watching this right now, if you could chime in on this and give me some clarification, because I personally am having trouble wrapping my head around the benefit here beyond preserving the rails. Because to me, it would only make it more likely that the bridge would suffer a cataclysmic failure. And spoiler alert, it totally did it. During the flood, 2 of the 5 spans of the bridge collapsed at about 12:06 p.m., again on July 13th, 1951. And it took the 3 aforementioned steam locomotives with it into the water. And since it was a flood situation, the water was very strong, very high, very deep. Those engines were gone. When the water level dropped and things started getting back to normal, repairs were made to the bridge, fixing it, and it actually still stands today as far as I can tell. But no effort was made to find the 3 locomotives. Like I said, they were already going to be scrapped. Santa Fe really didn't have a reason to go looking for them at that point. It would have cost more to bring them back up than they'd ever get out of scrap, so they were just left, but that wasn't the last we ever heard of them. 3167, one of the Mikados, as well as 1035, the Prairie, were actually seen again. A few years later, a particularly dry season hit the Kaw, and the river level was very, very low. So low that these 2 engines were actually discovered, poking out of the water, stuck in mounds of dirt. They each wound up in separate locations, which kind of makes sense in a flood situation, but they hadn't gone too far from where they fell in. After all, steam engines are incredibly heavy, so since they were spotted, were they brought up? No. Santa Fe actually ordered work crews out to cut pieces off these 2 locomotives for spare parts, and then leave the rest that they couldn't get to. And they're still there. Still under the water. And none of my sources can say exactly what parts they took off of them, but yeah, hey, good job, guys. You just left them there. You know, I know you were gonna scrap them, but it's still kind of upsetting as a rail fan. That's all I'm trying to say. But I bet you're wondering, wait, 3 engines went in. What about 4076, the other Mikado? Haha, good question. No one knows that answer. I mean, they know she went into the water, but she's never been found. Out of the 3, she's the one true ghost engine, because no one knows where she ended up. And she could be in a lot of different places east of that bridge where the current goes. And since it's a river, as was established, it tends to bury big, heavy things. But 4076 is the only one that should be completely intact, as she was not located by Santa Fe and therefore had no parts taken off of her. To date, there's been no expedition set up to actually find any of the locomotives. Even the exact locations of the other 2 that were found seem pretty obscure, and in fact none of my sources specifically say exactly where they are. And I did my own investigation into this because I was legitimately curious. I used Google Earth to look east of the bridge to see if I could locate anything that resembled a steam engine. And the result of my expert opinion of satellite imagery is that I do not believe that this is going to be helpful in this situation, as when I was looking at it, I had a bit of an issue where I could not tell if certain dark things under the water were, in fact, a steam locomotive or, say, a rock. It doesn't seem like the way to go. I believe a magnometer would be a bit more accurate, or at least give us some kind of a better clue. You'd have to get people on the ground there looking for it. And as for bringing it up, well, 3176 and 1035 have had pieces taken off, so they're not intact. 4076 could be in pretty good shape, all things considered. Compared to a lot of the sunken trains I've talked about, it's been submerged for a relatively shorter amount of time by comparison. It's only been a little over 60 years, which I know sounds like a lot, but compared to the other locomotives that have been down for hundreds and still retain some level of good condition, I would bet that 4076 probably isn't in that bad a shape. The problem is that she's a Mikado. Mikados were an insanely popular type of steam locomotive. Over 14,000 were manufactured in the United States alone, and plenty saw preservation. So the problem isn't going to be down to whether or not she's intact, it's, like always, how worth it will it be to bring her up? I mean, I would love to bring her back up, but I don't have the thousands upon thousands of dollars it would take to do that. Do you? Okay, that's what I thought. I don't think anyone here really has the financial means to do this. And as for making her run again, okay, look, we've been over this how many times, and I still to this day get comments about it. It is going to be very difficult to get any kind of locomotive to run again after being underwater for so long. You, as a person, get wrinkly if you are in the water for more than a half hour, okay? These machines are made of metal. They rust. There's so many inner working parts that can get damaged. So getting her back to a running state would be a tremendous undertaking. I'm not saying it's impossible. I've never said it's impossible. It's a matter of reasonability. And in this instance, and pretty much all the instances I've talked about, the likelihood of that happening is remote at best. Even bringing her up in this case is pretty unlikely, but at this point, we don't even know where she's at, and frankly, that's where I'm stuck at. I want this engine found. I want to know what state she's in. I just want to know where she ended up. A steam engine can only be a ghost engine as long as they're out of sight. So I would say it's worth it to at least locate 4076, its final resting place, so we can close the book on the subject and just know what happened to her. Anything beyond that, well, we would have to see what kind of conditions is in, and then we can debate about it. But until that time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.